Hi, I'm Linda, a retired educator from M.S.U. Extension and a passionate gardener. I've been gardening since I was very young and was fortunate to learn from my grandmother and from both of my parents. So I've done a lot of trial and error over the years, and working for M.S.U. Extension have some science to back up why some things worked and why some things didn't. So hopefully I'll be able to share some useful tips with you on this video. Thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing comments posted when we're all done. I am going to talk about gardening tasks that are worth your effort this fall yet. They will help your gardens get off to a healthy start next spring. Fall is a great time to review your landscape and start next year's to-do list. It's a wonderful time to take a look at what worked really well in your garden this year, what didn't work so well. Are there plants that really weren't happy where you had them and maybe need a different spot? Or are there plants that just didn't thrive and you're trying to figure out what to do to make them happier next year? So this is a great time, and I encourage you to take your smartphone or a camera out into your landscape and snap pictures of what the successes were and the areas you think, I can do that one better next year. Because if you're like me, in the middle of winter, you may go, I know there was something I wanted to do different, but what was it? So take those photos. You'll enjoy them through the winter. We have a hard time getting through our Michigan winters. They're a little bit bleak sometimes. So you will enjoy seeing what was beautiful in your landscape this year. We'll start. I'm going to cover all parts of your landscape, starting with flower bed cleanup. Do you clean up your flower beds once the plants have died because of the cold weather? I would encourage you to consider leaving those stems in your gardens because they provide habitat and food and egg-laying sites for pollinators and beneficial insects. And we all know the value of the pollinators. The beneficial insects can help you keep your problem pests under control. So consider leaving them. They can also prevent erosion. If you have any slopes that the soil is open, if you cut back the plants, leave the plants there, and that will help prevent you losing soil to the bottom of the slope over the winter when we get the rains and the snows. Also, it's a great time to save seeds. Who doesn't love more plants? And you can get them for free by collecting seeds from the plants in your landscape. It's also, and this is probably the hardest thing I'm going to say to you in this video, it's a great time to pull weeds. The reason being then, next spring, when you're out into the garden, you have fewer weeds to deal with. And you can get started on the projects that you really want to be working on. It's also a wonderful time to mulch your beds with compost or with healthy chopped leaves. Those add nutrients, organic matter. They can help improve your soil over the winter. So this is a great time. And if you've already pulled those weeds, done that terrible task, it helps protect your soil from sprouting new weeds over the winter. So taking a look at a landscape in the wintertime, I don't know about you, but I think even though it's midwinter, this is a beautiful landscape. And I wouldn't mind looking at that every day out my kitchen window or living room window. But if you look at that and imagine, you can see how that can provide wonderful cover for the pollinators and beneficial insects in our environment. The only exception to leaving plant stems once they've died is the disease stems. You may want to get rid of those. cut them down, put them in the trash, don't compost them. And the reason for that is that some of our diseases, like mildew, which many of us deal with, can overwinter in our soil. So if you remove as much of the diseased tissue as you can, then hopefully you'll have less mildew or whatever disease issue you deal with next year. Grasses, I think, also provide wonderful visual impact over the winter. I love the way they blow in the wind, even if it's a blizzardy wind. So those leave, and then in the spring, you can cut them down to 4 to 6 inches before the new growth starts. So it's a very short period of time when you aren't enjoying the beauty of all of the grasses in our landscapes. Talk a little bit about keeping plants healthy. I mentioned that in the last slide. As I said, if you do have any diseased foliage, it's a good idea to remove it in the fall. And that can be bagged and put into the trash, not into a compost pile or bin. The thing to remember is if you are using pruners to cut down that dead material or diseased material, you want to make sure you disinfect the blades of your pruners between plants so that you're not spreading diseases from one plant to another, which only makes your problems more difficult to deal with next year. You can do that very simply by dipping those blades into rubbing alcohol, like a 70% isopropyl alcohol, which you can get at the grocery store, you can get it at a pharmacy. It's a great thing to have as part of your garden toolkit. So now we've got all the disease material out of the garden, and it's a great time to plant many different types of plants. I'll talk first about the bulbs. You've probably seen these showing up in your garden centers, grocery stores, everywhere this time of the year. You have lots of choices. I start with garlic. I don't know if you grow garlic and or vegetables. Fall is a wonderful time to plant garlic. It may be a little bit challenging to find it. Not all garden centers carry it in the fall. They wait until spring. But I like to plant it in the fall because it gets settled in and it starts growing. And in the spring, it takes off even faster than it does if you plant it in the spring. And briefly, kind of a general rule of thumb with how deep should I plant my bulbs is think about the height of a bulb. If a garlic bulb is, let's say, 2 inches tall, plant it 4 inches deep. So double the height, and you will have it in a position where it's got the depth it needs so that you'll be able to get blossoms. I don't know if you've ever had bulbs planted and they didn't blossom and you're like, why not? It may be because they weren't planted at the right depth. So you can always dig them up and put them deeper or shallower, whatever they need. It's also a great time to plant grass seed. If you have a turfgrass lawn and you have bare spots that don't look very healthy right now, it's great because it's cooler. We usually have a little more moisture, so the seed doesn't dry out quite as quickly, and that gives the new grass plants a chance to begin to get established before winter sets in and then be ready to grow in the spring. Spring blooming bulbs, like I said, there's so many different types, and they add such beautiful color to the landscape in the spring. And we all have our favorites. I think probably tulips are a general favorite of many, especially if you don't have deer to deal with. Deer consider tulips to be plant candy. It's also a good time to do trees and shrubs and perennials, whether you're planting new plants or whether you're dividing the ones that you already have. This is a good time, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. Fall's a great time to plant and divide and transplant new perennials, shrubs, trees, because, like I said, with the grass seed, it's a little bit cooler. We usually have a little bit more rain, and the root systems have a chance to get settled in before winter sets in, and then they are better able to start growing in the spring. When you do plant new plants or you divide and transplant, it's a good idea to give your plants a little bit of extra TLC. What I mean by that is just make sure that the soil doesn't dry out for the first, well, until winter sets in. When you do plant, whether you're transplanting or putting in new plants, it's a good idea to give your plants a little bit of extra TLC. If the soil gets really dry, that stresses out the plants. They have a little bit harder time settling in and being healthy. So just making sure that the soil doesn't dry out completely will give them moisture so that the roots can start growing, the plants will be healthy in the spring, and you'll be thrilled with all of your new acquisitions next spring. Do recommend it in the fall that you do not fertilize your annuals are just about done now, but your perennials and your shrubs and trees. And the reason for that is that after about mid-August, it can stimulate new growth, which doesn't have a chance to harden off before winter sets in. So that new growth can get killed by the winter winds and cold, and that actually is a stressor for your plants. So that's one of the dates that we encourage you to remember. Mid-August is a date for stopping fertilization of most of your plants. An exception is people who grow show roses. Often they are fertilizing those about once a month and into the fall because roses tend to still put out a fair amount of growth in the fall. And if they have shows or if they are growing them to share or compete, they want to get as many blossoms as they can. Who doesn't? Next, I want to talk a little bit about the moisture issue, but with your trees and shrubs. If you look at the image on the screen, that will help you visualize what I'm talking about, because our irrigation systems are designed to water turf grass for the most part. So they're usually set up to just provide enough water to go down a couple of inches, which is how deep the roots of the turfgrass plants go. They're not designed for deep root watering, as you can see in the image, like a tree has. So if the weather forecasters are talking about droughty weather, and it's a good time to think about your specimen trees and shrubs that you may want to make sure don't get too stressed in that weather. And it's very easy to water them. So watering trees, the easiest way is to put a soaker hose down halfway between the trunk of the tree and the outer drip line. As you see in the image here, it's showing you the drip line is just the outer reach of the branches and the leaves. Lay it down on the soil around that in a circle and let it run for several hours. Or if this is a mature, large tree, let it run overnight. That's not putting out a huge amount of water at a time, and it just is a wonderful trickle, like a soft, gentle rain. Think of it that way. Then the other thing you can do to help protect your trees and shrubs is mulch. Put down mulch around the base of the tree. If you look at this image, you can see there's a circle of mulch that goes out. Oh, it can go out all the way to the drip line if you want it to. It doesn't have to go that far. The only thing to be careful of is you don't want any mulch up against the trunk of your plants, because that can be a habitat for insects and diseases, and you don't want to create more problems than you've solved. Mulch should be 2 to 4 inches deep is the best. That's enough to help reduce evaporation, to help keep weeds down. And it's also, that ring helps protect the trees from weed whips, mowers, which can create wounds in the trunks of the trees, and then you've got other issues to deal with. So it's an easy thing to do to help keep your trees and shrubs healthy. Rhododendrons which are so beautiful in the spring with their beautiful blooms, do lose a lot of moisture through their leaves in the winter. The winter winds cause them to just lose more moisture than they really need to lose. So the recommendation to keep your rhododendrons healthy for next year is just before the ground freezes. If we haven't had a fair amount of rain, you might want to water that soil around the base of the rhododendrons so that it's well watered. Then they have plenty of moisture available to the roots so that as that moisture is evaporating out of the leaves, there's more available to help them get through the winter and be healthy next spring. The other thing you may see at garden centers are sprays. They're called anti-desiccants, which doesn't matter. What they're supposed to do is help protect the leaves from losing moisture. These sprays aren't recommended for rhododendrons because they block up the pores in the leaves of the plant, which can create other problems. So you may be tempted to do this thinking you're helping the plant, but in the case of rhododendrons, I would say just pass by and let them get through winter with the water you've added to the soil. Sometimes I get asked, should we wrap our trees? And there are instances when this is a good idea. And younger trees. Some varieties of trees, when they're young, they can get what we call sun scald in the winter. And basically what happens is it's cold at night. We get a sunny day and it warms up the tissue of the tree and it causes the bark to split open as that water expands. So in order to prevent that, which is an open wound, which can create its own problems for your trees, it's easy to wrap the tree trunks in the winter, do it in fall, and then take it off again in spring when the leaves are beginning to form and open up. There are multiple materials you can use. It should be porous. There's like a fabric wrap you can purchase at garden centers. There is a paper wrap that I've used also that is very porous and easy to wrap around and tie on. There are also plastic wraps that you can reuse from year to year. You want to make sure that they have holes so that there's air circulation getting behind there, because you can create additional problems if moisture gets trapped behind whatever you have used as a wrap. And as I said, then in the spring, remove that. And there are a number of trees that are susceptible when they are young. Maples, we all have maples, ash, most of the fruit trees, the flowering cherry trees. So it's not a bad idea if you're putting in a new tree to protect it through the winter, because if you just paid to install this beautiful new tree, we don't like to see them get damaged by winter weather. Or these wraps also will protect the trunks from rodent damage. Rabbits and deer especially sometimes like to chew on the bark of our young trees. And then a couple of dates that are important to remember. One I've already mentioned, and that is fertilizing. Don't fertilize trees and shrubs after August 15th. So that you're not stimulating new growth late in the season that may not make it through the winter. A tip, sometimes I get asked questions about hydrangeas, especially the hydrangeas that have the blue and pink blooms, the big leaf ones. People say, they aren't blossoming. Why not? It may be because your hydrangeas are not quite hardy enough to get through winter weather here without it affecting next year's blossoms. So a way to make sure that that doesn't happen, that you have a beautiful display, is to wait to prune your hydrangeas until about Mother's Day next year. That's usually by Mother's Day, we're through the risk of hard frost or freeze, which can kill the flower buds that are on the stems of your hydrangeas if they are not really, really hardy. So it's just a good rule of thumb. If you're not sure what hydrangeas you have, just wait until then. And then it's really easy to see where the dead tissue is separated from the living tissue, and you can get in and do your pruning. We also don't recommend that you prune oak trees between about March 15th and November 1st. Those dates depend on the weather. What happens is there's a disease that can kill oak trees very, very quickly called oak wilt. And it is spread in two ways. One through roots of touching trees, but the other way is by an insect, a very small insect that is attracted to the sap of oak trees. So if there's a cut in an oak tree that's open, it attracts these insects. If they have been on an infected tree, they're spreading it to your healthy tree. And once the disease moves into your tree, there is really very little that can be done, if anything, to save it. So just as a precaution, we have that deadline. And actually, I like to prune in the winter, especially late winter if I'm doing the pruning, because it's easy when the leaves are off the tree to see what needs to be pruned. So something to think about. Talking about pruning, go into that just a little bit more in depth. This is a topic that can be a whole day long class, and then there will still be questions afterwards. So I'll just hit on a couple of things that I think might help you in your home landscape. You can prune out dead, diseased, broken branches on trees and shrubs pretty much any time, with the exception of the oak trees we talked about. You can prune out what we call water sprouts. And water sprouts, if you look at the branch of a tree and it has a number of branches that are growing right straight up in toward the sun, those are water sprouts. You also may get sprouts growing from the bottom, the soil. And if you look at the diagram on the screen, the tree, it shows you an example of a water sprout, and it shows an example of another one type of growth that you want to take out. And that's what we call a crossing branch. And that's a branch that grows across the center of the tree or shrub. Often those get in the way. They rub against other healthy branches, and so we recommend just cutting those out. And when you are pruning large branches, if you look in the upper left corner of this diagram, it shows the ideal way to cut large branches so that you don't get tearing when you make a cut. So if you look at the numbers, number 1 is the first cut, and that one's from the bottom of the branch out about 6 to 8 inches, and you go about a third of the way through the branch. And what that does is it's going to give you some flexibility as you make the next 2 cuts. Then you go just a little bit further out that branch from the top. You cut down about a third of the way. Again, it's going to provide some flexibility and release some pressure as you make the final cut, the cut you really want to make, which is number 3 on that diagram. What I would like you to pay attention to there is there's an area called the root collar. And if you look at that diagram, you can see in this instance it's darker. It looks like a collar. You don't want to cut into that collar because that can impact the health of the entire tree. So go out just a little bit. You also notice that's on an angle. The reason for that is so that when it rains or there's dew, the moisture is falling off that cut while it seals itself, so that you don't have to worry about diseases getting into the whole tree as a result of the cut. And then shrubs is the ideal. And this one's hard for me. I don't know, maybe you're better about this one. But if you look at that shrub on the bottom, the left image shows you what it looks like maybe now at the end of summer going into fall. Ideal pruning for those caning shrubs is to take out about a third of the old stems down to about 4 inches above the ground, and provide lots of airspace and light, so that there's lots of light and air movement getting into the base of that shrub, and that helps prevent insect and disease problems and gives the whole plant more sunlight so it grows even better. So those are three tips about pruning. That's a lot of information crammed into a very short bit. But there are good videos online about pruning. And if you have a chance to attend a workshop or a seminar in person, it's well worth it if you are doing any pruning in your own landscape. So I wanted to take just a second and do a little bit of a demo here. I have a branch just to make sure, and I'll show you if I were making a smaller pruning cut, not the large tree branch one, but just a smaller branch. I always want to, well, let me hold it upright. It may be easier for you to see what I'm doing. If I'm going to do some pruning, I cut it, see the angle there? And what happens then is you have that nice angle so that, as I said just a minute ago, the moisture just runs off. Trees and shrubs have this wonderful capacity to seal their own wounds, and it usually starts to happen within about 24 hours. And for that reason, and other reasons, we encourage you not to seal off wounds like this. The only exception would be if we're talking about an oak tree that has to be pruned during the active growing season. Then it is recommended you use a landscape paint or something to seal that wound, just so you're protecting it as much as you can from oak wilt. But for the rest of your cuts, you don't need to be using landscape paint. And this is a change. Over the years, there was a belief that you should be sealing every cut you make to protect your trees and shrubs. And what actually we found out through research is that you may be sealing disease spores or insect eggs or other problems into, and then they have a chance to settle in, reproduce, and cause real serious problems for your plants. So we've decided that maybe the trees and shrubs do it better on their own than with our intervention. Okay, so moving on from the pruning to fall lawn care. This is another one where we have changed over the years what we recommend. If you have been gardening for a while, you will probably remember it used to be the standard for your lawn. When we got into November, that grass should be cut just as short as you could, and there should not be a single leaf left laying on top of it, which maybe looked nice, but we have discovered that that's not the healthiest way to leave a turfgrass lawn over the winter. So now it's recommended that you mow. Set your mower height just as high as you can. The reason is that the longer the grass blades are, the more sunlight has a chance to reach them and photosynthesize, creating food for the root system. So the more leaves you have on your grass plants, the more food you're building up for the roots so that they are healthier plants to start next spring. The other thing we have learned is that leave the leaves. I'm sure you've all heard that, and that can sometimes be a little difficult if you've been doing your lawn another way for many years. But as you see in the image on the screen, whether you use a regular mower or a mulching mower, run it over the leaves several times so that you are creating small pieces, maybe about the size of a cherry or a blueberry, and leave those over the winter. They will break down, they will settle into the turf. As they break down, they will feed your soil, feed the roots of the turf grass, And again, it gives you healthier turf grass to start next year's growing season. So leave the leaves. Now, if you have a lot of leaves and you can mulch them up and chop them and you're like, you can't see the lawn at all, and you're feeling like that may be too much to leave behind, you can always take some of the extra and you can put it in a compost pile. You can put it on the soil in your garden beds. Don't get rid of it. It's wonderful to add as long as your leaves aren't diseased. Leave them in your garden and lawn someplace where they can create food and help your soil for next year. In our region, the average first frost is October 7th. And this is important if you're like me and you want to keep your plants alive for just as long as you possibly can. I start listening late September and to the weather forecast, listening for those freeze or frost warnings. And then I decide, okay, which plants do I want to try and keep alive a little longer? In my case, it's often the vegetable and the herb plants. I have this personal goal of having fresh herbs for Thanksgiving at the end of November. Sometimes that can be a bit of a challenge to accomplish, but I enjoy trying. So if you pay attention to the weather forecast, then if you do have plants you'd like to get them to hang on for a little bit longer, there are a couple of things that you can do. And in the process, you will probably end up entertaining your neighbors. We'll start with the vegetable gardens. You can extend the harvest by protecting the tender plants from frost. What you see on the slide on the screen is a little, we call it a tunnel, that's created with PVC pipe and fabric that's designed to go over plants. This is easy to find at garden centers, online, wherever you purchase your garden supplies. And it is just enough of a barrier so that the frost, as it falls, hits that fabric and doesn't make it to your plant tissue. So it's important, if you're going to do this, to leave a little bit of airspace between the top of your plants and the fabric. Because if the fabric's laying right against the plants, you won't protect them. The frost will get through that fabric and it will kill the plants. Then, the next day, when the sun comes up and the temperatures start to warm, you can peel that fabric back so that your vegetable plants are getting as much sun, warm sunlight, as possible. And I wanted to show you just a minute. One other thing I do to extend my harvest is the herbs I talked about. I also save herbs, and what you see here on the table is, I wish you could smell it, it's a basil, a Thai basil that I like to grow and use in cooking. But when it becomes clear that we're getting freezing temperatures on a regular basis, and this plant is tender to frost and freeze, then I will harvest. And there are many ways to do it. For me, the easiest way is to cut the stems. And I do this usually about mid-morning, if I can. The dew has dried from the leaves at that point, and that's when the flavor of these herbs is strongest. So I just take brown paper bags, and I stick the stems down into the bags, and then I put on the bag what it is. Usually that's not a problem, figure it out, even after they've dried. And I also put the date, and it's not absolutely essential, but it helps me. I kind of have learned over the years how long it will take for these to dry. And so I pay attention to when I put them in there. And then I put them in a dark, dry space, downstairs basement room for me, and let them dry naturally. And then when it gets closer to the holidays, I get them out, strip the leaves off, chop up the leaves, and package them up into spice jars, and they become holiday gifts for people. And people love to get your fresh herbs. The flavor and the aromas are stronger, I think, than what you get from the grocery store. So that way I'm making most use of the harvest. Many of us like to grow plants like canna and dahlia. Dahlias, I think, are so beautiful, so many beautiful colors. These bulbs are not hardy in our area, with very few exceptions, and so they need to be dug out of the soil and saved until next year if you want to enjoy them again next year. And it's easy enough to do. Just dig them up in the fall, let them dry, put them out on a screen or a picnic table or something, and then shake off the excess dirt that you can get off them, and then store them in a cool, dry place, like a mesh bag. Some people use crumpled up newspaper. Some people use dry peat moss. You know, when you buy peat moss in a bag and it's so dry you can't get water to stay in it. That's great for saving these tender bulbs. And then store them in a cool, dry place for the winter. And next spring you can start them again and enjoy their beauty for many years by doing this. I also mentioned earlier collecting seeds and how our plants provide us with the starting material for many new plants. And fall is a great time to save these seeds. I wanted to come back around to this and just encourage you. There is a wonderful information available to you through books. If you search online for seed collecting and sorting, that's one website I found that has really good information. And then in the winter is a great time to winter sow the seeds, especially those native seeds that need cold stratification in order to germinate. And the library's YouTube channel has a wonderful video on that topic, so search for that. Okay, back to the vegetable garden. Now that you've extended the season and the frost and freeze have won out and you have dead plant material, you can remove that plant debris with one exception, and I encourage you to leave the legumes. The legumes are beans, peas, and leaving those dead plants on the soil to start to break down or to break down over the winter releases nitrogen into your soil. So you are actually doing some fertilization by doing nothing. And we love those easy tips for gardening. Sometimes it seems like there's a lot of work that goes into this, so the easy ones are just wonderful. The hardier plants like carrots and onions and greens and the brassicas, which include broccoli and cauliflower, they're much hardier and they can survive colder weather, especially if you provide them with some mulch. Row covers, and then I like to, for example, with my carrots, pile up mulch up to about 6 inches deep, leaf mulch, and leave that around the carrots. And then when I'm ready for some fresh carrots from the garden, I go out and push that back and pull the carrots, and we have fresh carrots well into January usually, before they're gone. So it's nice to be able to enjoy the fresh produce well into our Michigan winters. Another thing to consider in the vegetable garden is if you have used plastic or metal stakes, especially on tomatoes, which tend to get a variety of wilts and other diseases, if you can leave those exposed to the winter weather, that cold, freezing temperature may kill some of the disease spores that were on those stakes. So that next spring, when you put the stakes back in the garden, you aren't starting problems by using stakes that have last year's disease spores on them. So if you have a place to do that, that's a great idea. Fall is also a great time to be improving your soil so that you have even more flowers and produce and bigger, healthier plants next year. A good place to start is to test your soil. And on the screen is a website for soil testing kits that are available from M.S.U. Extension. And you purchase the kit, it comes with instructions, you put in your soil, mail it in, and they send you a report by email with recommendations and information about what your soil may be lacking, what it has plenty of. You will find there is enough information there to keep you busy reading and learning through a portion of the winter. As I mentioned before, it's a great time to remove weeds, as hard as that can be to think about. It's a great time to mulch, I mentioned that before, and it's a great time to add compost. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about compost. This is the best soil amendment out there. And you can make your own compost for no cost and a little bit of effort, or you can buy bagged compost from garden centers. If it does improve your soil texture, regardless of whether you have a sandy soil, a clay soil, it can make your soils better. It can improve drainage. A sandy soil, for example, the water just runs right through. Adding compost can help slow down that percolation of the water so that it stays around the roots longer. It can replenish organic matter. The organic matter in our soils breaks down over time. And so adding compost replenishes what is breaking down on an ongoing basis. It's also an organic fertilizer, so it's adding nutrients at a level that is just ideal for our soils, and it makes an excellent mulch. And you can add compost to your soils in multiple ways. You can use it as a mulch. You can turn it into your soil. You can use it when you are doing the planting or the transplanting and add some to your planting holes. So any way you can get it incorporated into the soil, even if that's letting it sit on top and break down and work its way into the soil, it's fantastic. If you're interested in learning more about composting at home, there's a wonderful website online. It's titled Composting at Home. So just search for Composting at Home. This one is offered by the Environmental Protection Agency and shares information about how to get started, what's okay for the compost pile or bin, and is a great way to get started. So this is another thing to think about this winter. If you don't have a compost pile or a bin, think about how you might be able to add one to your landscape. I promise you will be thrilled with the results of this. Ideally, we all take care of our tools, and maybe you do this better than I do, every time I use them. I tend to get to fall and think, oh, I didn't clean that one off very well. I probably should before winter starts, and this is a good time to do that so that the tools at least are clean through the winter. So you can spray off the dirt with a hose, as you see on the screen, and then you can use a wire brush to help get that soil out of the little cracks and crevices or the soil that doesn't want to come off. You can remove the rust. I mean, we spend a fair amount of money for garden tools. And so keep taking care of them so they last longer means we have more money to spend on plants. And I like that philosophy. It's a good time to sharpen the blades, whether you do this yourself or whether you have it professionally done. And then when all of that is done, coat the blades with mineral oil and put them in a place for the winter that is dry. And some people I know take their small hand tools, and after they've been coated with mineral oil, they actually store them blade down in a bucket of clean sand, clean dry sand. because it is dry. If any moisture gets around it, it drains quickly, and it helps keep them protected. So, little tip there. In addition to the tools, think about protecting your containers. If you have terracotta pots, and if you've had them for a while, if you've ever left them out over the winter, you know what happens in freezing temperature to terracotta. It tends to crack, split, flake, just not hold up very well. So it's always a good idea to protect terracotta pots from freezing through the winter. Can you leave the soil in them to do that? Yes, you can, as long as the soil's had a chance to dry out. As freezing temperatures make the moisture expand and contract, that can help create cracking, which you don't want. The other question I get a lot is it okay to overwinter containers that may have perennials in them in addition to annuals or bulbs? And the answer is yes. Some plants, some hardy plants, will survive the winter in containers. And containers are like a small garden, and if they are left exposed to the weather, the temperature fluctuates in them much more quickly than it does in the ground. So that freezing and thawing can kill all but the very hardiest of plants. So some things you can do would be to move those containers into a shed or a garage where there's a little protection, where they won't get quite so cold. You can also actually plant the container. Dig a hole in a garden, put the pot down into the garden soil so that it's not going to freeze and thaw quite so easily, and then pull it up in the spring, and hopefully your plants will have survived and be ready to start growing again. It's a good time too, if you have pots, containers that you want to clean because there were some disease issues with the plants in that container. This is a good time to do that. And you can use a 10% bleach solution and a wire brush to scrub that out. And that may get rid of also some of the fertilizer salts that build up on containers. I'm sure you've all seen this. Gets crusty white around the rims or the bases. That's from the fertilizer salt. And so a wire brush may brush some of that off for you too. Also, thinking about water, fall, don't forget to drain your hoses, drain your irrigation system, and turn off your outdoor faucets so that you don't have an expensive plumber's bill next spring when you're ready to start up. Also wanted to mention, protect if you have fertilizer or if you use herbicides that have not been used up this year. You want to protect those from freezing because the freezing temperatures can break down some of those so that they become ineffective. And that would be an unfortunate expense, again, when money you could be spending on more plants. There are many, many resources available online, and I would encourage you to look for reliable sources. Just like with everything else, there's some good advice out there, and there's some not so good advice out there. So look for sites like universities, libraries, conservation groups that are going to be providing you with reliable, time-tested, science-based information, because some of the things that you may see and be tempted to try, they could be very costly, and they can sometimes actually cause damage to your plants. So check out the library's YouTube channel. And the site that's on the screen is offered by M.S.U. Extension. It's called Gardening in Michigan. So if you do an online search for Gardening in Michigan, you will get to this page. And there are answers to garden questions on just about any topic you have on that site. So that was another way to help us survive the winter, is to explore and learn and dream of next year's gardens. So once these fall tasks are complete, you can spend the winter getting ready for your gardening next spring by reviewing your photos and notes and starting that to-do list. And as it gets closer to spring, if you're like me, that list starts getting longer and longer, and I get more and more excited for weather so I can be out in the gardens. As I mentioned before, winter sowing seeds. This winter is a great time to do that. And there is a video on the Portage Library YouTube channel. Watch or attend garden seminars, programs, study gardening catalogs. Some of them have incredible information in them. Start your plant list for next year and dream about what the gardens are going to look like next year. So thank you very much for watching, and thank you to the Portage District Library for hosting this video, and I'll see you next spring.